really quickly, wanted to say thank you very much for joining us on our last summer series, especially with my kids starting school now. It's definitely the end of summer. Real quick introduction about myself, Kevin Curtis, about 23, 24 years in the space, procurement, pretty much all of it focused on SAP Ariba with a smattering around here, based out of Columbus, Ohio. Hey, Rich, how about you give ourselves a little intro and then we'll jump right into this.
All right. Yep. Quickly, since I know we're behind here. Yeah, Richard Potts. Rich, been with Primacati for 5 years and have done all sorts of things with our supplier enablement, contracts, lifecycle management, sourcing. So I've done a bunch of implementations on the buying and invoicing side, meaning supplier enablement for transaction purposes. So I've kind of seen a lot of different customers kind of from soup to nuts in terms of the front end implementation process and also kind of supplier onboarding challenges that we commonly encounter. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me on, Kevin.
Awesome. Yep. And no, I appreciate that. And just for the people joining us today, really our thought was, I know we've been focused on a lot of kind of lessons learned conversations. Since these tend to be supplier management, supplier manager roles, can be a little bit tactically focused, thought it made sense to bring someone in from more of a practitioner, day-to-day practitioner standpoint. So, with that, Rich, let's go ahead and start out just kind of around some topics, related to effective supplier management overall. I know you have deployed specifically the Ariba supplier management tool at numerous locations, but what are your thoughts in terms of frankly what I view the critical role of supplier management and just the modern supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and great question and very important question, and I would say that's something that has been impacted very heavily, needless to say, by COVID and that kind of black swan environment. I think the world of supply chain management in general is still recovering to some degree from that heavy impact as well. But I'm even thinking of something, a longer term process that I think is really, really important and impacts so many different industries. And that's what I would call, for lack of a better term, the blood diamond effect. This idea that, our as consumers, for one thing, they kind of want to know now, it seems, they're more interested than ever than knowing how did this widget end up in my hands, right? What is it made from? Whose hands did it pass through? Are the hands clean, so to speak, that got this widget from point A to point B? And customers have, I think, end users of or consumers have changed to some degree, or it's evolving their kind of their moral calculus when they're making purchasing choices. And that blood diamond effect has certainly, I don't think it's a cynical or passing trend by any means. And it's been picked up, and I think it's been absorbed by businesses. And so it's also now becoming a very important part of how businesses structure their relationship with their supply chain. And so, and again, I don't know if, you can call it something else. I think blood diamond effect is maybe a little harsh, but I think it gets at what's going on there, right? This idea that more than ever, because of federal regulations and also just the changing cultural preferences of purchasers, B2B or end users, these things are becoming very important. How are we able to assess and make transparent processes and the provenance of our products and our assemblages in ways that maybe weren't even expected before. Thankfully, we have some tools in place that can make that possible, because in a world where things would be fully manual, I don't know how that would ever be even possible as well. So, and again, I would say, we don't want to spend a lot of time on technology itself, but I think that's where you have to think carefully about your tools and what items, what systems are you deploying to be able to make that process manageable or even feasible in some ways. And so I think that's a really, really big one, in addition to all of the stresses that come from black swan events like, COVID, that put just tremendous tactical and strategic challenges in front of our businesses today as well. So that's
Yeah.
one of the big things that's on my mind. Certainly,
I
this.
think that's I think those are all fantastic points. Understanding, of course, Blood Diamond, certainly a dark reference, but very real.
Yeah.
And then just that emphasis of whether it's a black swan event or just trying to strengthen your supply chains across the board. I know some of our high tech customers and customers in aerospace and defense. One of their biggest challenges is ensuring that the components they're installing into their products are the actual fully spec'd components
Right.
that they are procuring across the board.
Yeah.
And, starting to look at a real use for blockchain. Hey, this was originated here. It comes across. If you attempt to push down into that level of specificity and you do not have a incredibly tight supplier management strategy in place,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not going to be possible. Let's let me pivot just a little bit. So certainly understand the need for a strong supply chain, strong supplier management strategy and approach. Certainly the value of the supplier relationship overall across the entire procurement platform. I wanted just to, kind of get your thoughts with a slight pivot, kind of based on your experience, what would you say are some of the critical pieces to lend itself to a successful deployment of a supplier management tool? And, maybe break that down into a couple of pieces if you could. Like, let's potentially let's start out as just kind of, okay, there is the onboarding process, and then of course, the data management process, right, et cetera. But yeah, if you could just give us some thoughts on that.
Absolutely. This is, I think, the supplier onboarding process. When you talk about a successful deployment of any tool, again, SLP being the one that I think of most. But if you're going to be successful with this, I think one of the most important things you can do right off the bat is very carefully and intentionally prepare your supplier base for this transition. It's very easy to assume that your supplier base understands the value of their relationship with you. Obviously, this is a critical, there's transactions taking place, but it's very easy to assume that your supplier base understands why you have made this decision as this particular company, why you're moving to this platform. So I think one of the most important things you can do in that process is standardize your communications with all of the supplier base that's coming on board. And I would say take it very, very seriously. I think one of the things that I see that so frequently betrays our best efforts when we're doing supplier onboarding is simply the idea underestimating what it's actually going to take to even get your willing suppliers to participate in this. They have a lot going on. They've got a lot vested in their own status quo processes. So trying to get them to move to something new, I think, is not always as straightforward or as easy as flipping a switch, even though the tool, we've chosen whatever tool it is because we believe in it. And trying to get your supplier base, especially if it's a relational tool where they have to do something on their end, learn something new. I think it's just very, very important to standardize that, be consistent, positive, and I would say take an educator's approach to this, right? You want to help them, you want to facilitate, make sure they have the knowledge, to be able to make that, to take that step. You talk about, there's other things that come to mind, data management as well, risk management, performance monitoring. These are all things that our customers certainly want to get in place. This is one of the reasons you move to, in most cases, to some sort of enterprise tool. And so you really have to understand exactly what it is that we want, to measure, for example, if we're doing performance, and building scorecards carefully around, metrics that are meaningful and don't simply provide additional friction for our own internal user base. These are things that sometimes when we do our implementations, obviously you can't have consensus decision making from top all the way to the bottom, but I think it's too often the case that you don't sort of get that grassroots feedback to understand the ways in which our own internal users might end up trying to work around the systems that we create because they've produced friction in kind of the day-to-day that maybe the end users of our own internal systems don't always understand. So you have to have a complete view of your supplier onboarding process. How does this affect my internal users? How does this affect my supplier users and the people that are going to be connecting to me through this tool or through this through this new process? And I think, the other piece that I think is extremely important when you talk about strategically targeting your supplier base, who are the suppliers we're going to work with first? Just doing a wide net approach and getting everyone on board or trying to onboard them in something new at the same time, I think introduces risks. You really want to prioritize and think about who should be in that wave one. Sometimes that's common sense. Maybe you have your suppliers are heavily weighted to one or another, but it may not be the case. There may be some strategic suppliers that have, to your point, Kevin, critical pieces of infrastructure, right? That maybe they're not our biggest dollar base, but they are critical to our business. You want to focus, you want to think very carefully about that process, because you don't want a supplier to slip through the cracks and then 6, 8, 10 months down the road, you find that they're still struggling to get through some of these basic processes or something, or you're finding legacy processes are still being used, when you're trying to move into this new relationship. So I've got my timer over here. I know I'm getting long-winded. There's a lot that could be said about this, because quite frankly, and this is near and dear to my heart, because you don't want to spend enormous amounts of money and time only get to the end of the process and find out that because maybe we didn't account for some of these challenges front end, that the tool isn't being used the way that we intend. We're not getting the value, out of that tool that we intend. So I would say, there's a lot more that could be said there, but those are some things that are top of mind for me when I think about what's involved in a successful deployment. You've got to do communication. You have to do effective segmentation, wave planning, and you also want to think about the types of metrics and tracking items that you really want to put in place, to say the least.
Yeah. With that, let me see if I can tease a little bit more out on one of these, because one of the challenges I've certainly observed over my career, specifically when you start to think about segmentation or managing the risk associated with your high priority suppliers. I am curious, what your thoughts would be specifically. So, understanding at a very high level a segmentation strategy. There's multiple ways to cut this up. I think probably certainly one of the standards is really identifying those suppliers that are critical. And this is much more important in, typically, I would say, a manufacturing environment.
Right.
However, in an educational environment, that could be service providers or data providers or other sources. But, if you could maybe just spend a little bit more time on kind of ideas or thoughts around the segmentation of the supplier, and a couple of different, either items that you've observed or just your thoughts around that.
Yeah, sure. Well, and I think you make a great point, Kevin, because I think each industry is going to approach this segmentation process very differently. And I think from an outside observer, the first cut would be, well, you start with the suppliers that are with whom we are spending the most money, right? That'd be like a typical first cut. But the fact of the matter is, in the day-to-day, when you sort of try to flesh this out, that is not necessarily, or even, first or second or third in some cases, priority for segmenting suppliers. And again, it is industry specific. I couldn't, hope to speak to all the different ways that you could cut the cookie dough there, but I am thinking of we have a supplier, or we had a customer not long ago that's in the auto, the traditional auto parts supply business. So not necessarily like electric vehicles, but kind of traditional. And, one of the ways that they were moving very aggressively was to segment their supplier base based on diversity objectives. Now, obviously you have to have, there's a quality control aspect of it as well. That's very, very high. But right there was diversifying their their supplier base so that they are meeting certain ESG objectives, right? So they had to rethink their supplier base entirely. And of course you have to have a way to vet and ensure that the folks that you are identifying as diverse are in fact diverse, right? That's part of this, this tracking process that I was describing earlier. And you need to have a tool that's able to kind of track and monitor that, or help you do that. But again, at the end of the day, it wasn't even so much, are our widgets, meeting the exact millimeters of manufacturing. That's obviously important, right? But we have these other things that we're ranking right alongside of this. Other suppliers, I know, their speed of delivery or locations are really important, and so it's not even so much what the object that they're giving to us, but from where is this coming? We want to try to get our suppliers. We want to redesign our supplier base based on a geographic relationship, to us in some ways, and so they're focusing on bringing them on board first because we want to do something new, in terms of how we're organizing our business, for example. So I think the great thing about that, though, is if you choose the right tool and you have a process in place where you think through these things carefully, these sorts of choices cease to become tedious, and they're really, really valuable and important, and can have direct impacts on the value that you get out of this transition process. And again, it's a lot about communication. Help your supplier base understand why you're doing the things that you're doing. Why are we making these choices? Hey, I'm the big customer with you guys. Why am I not in this first wave? I've heard from my other from my colleagues that are in this business that you're bringing these people on board. Well, we're doing something slightly different with our onboarding in this process. So that's extremely important as well. You have to be transparent, I think, also with your supplier base. So that's certainly something that would come to mind. Don't know if there's other aspects of that, Kevin, you want to tease out there, but those are things that are top of mind for me.
Yeah, no, I think without a doubt, I think how you are approaching it, and quite frankly, I would say that I typically see, especially dependent on the industry, of course, but kind of across the board, there are almost strategies of both enablement and management that can differ slightly, right? Number one, having a process in place certainly to manage the overall supplier life cycle. But then secondly, obviously there's going to be slightly different approaches that you would take for a key parts supplier, to kind of go back to your thought on, hey, it could be the highest dollar amount, but not necessarily, it could also be a supplier that can provide a commodity, which is very easily substituted out versus someone who's providing very specific pieces. Pieces, parts, etc. So I think you've kind of touched a little bit on some of the challenges and some of the ways to kind of get around some of these. I'd be curious to know, or just curious if you could provide a couple of thoughts on any of like the standard or common pitfalls or challenges that you've encountered either while developing in conjunction with a customer a supplier management program, or something where, hey, these were just things that we found very very challenging across the board.
Yeah, sure. And this was also, again, I'll issue the caveat here that most of this experience that I have these days is coming through trying to bring people into alignment with an enterprise tool, right? So that's definitely shapes a lot of this here. Yeah. But I would say, one of the most important things, or one of the most common things that I see, even when the company has made a strong decision, a strong move into a new tool and environment, is the reluctance to accept best practices. Let's say that. I would say there's and this is not even to say that the project teams that I encounter are not well-meaning, but it's very, very common that folks are reluctant to let go of something they've put and designed in place, and they don't necessarily. It takes time for them to be convinced that what we're doing, now is going to be better or adequate to what we have before. And I think The other thing is, especially that's a hurdle that you need to overcome. And I guess I would also boil that down. That's in part a communication challenge for
Right.
the company or the customer that's making the implementation. For those of us that are the software experts, it's obviously it's our job to help solve that problem, for them, certainly as well. The other piece of the puzzle that I would say is is quite frankly just mastering the tools that are put in front of them as well. This is something that I would say part of like a knowledge transfer process that is extremely important here as well. And well, maybe this is also because I'm our senior director of training. This is also something that's on my mind, but I think this is something that is so frequently, the focus is so often on standing up a new tool functionally, like getting this thing in place, that it can be, people can overlook does our team have the skill to actually bring this thing to life on behalf of, because if they can't do that, then all of this is for naught, right? That's common sense. But I think it's so frequently missed in these implementations. And so these tools have great power, but you must have the ability to execute them, and you have to have the right amount of knowledge transfer and capacity internally, to execute on that. And then, it's a drum I've beaten all through this talk so far here as well. But frequent communication with suppliers is so very important. I would say most of the problems that I have seen that have developed in implementations, or if things have had struggles down the road, is from a lack of communication. Suppliers not being necessarily aware of what's truly involved in the transition process, or why we're being moved into this new environment. And you can unintentionally create resistance on either end, internally or externally, by simply not explaining things sufficiently. So I think those are things that each industry, or there's probably folks on the phone that maybe are on the call here that have experiences, and they could probably shout right now, hey, I've got some real world examples that are in a different direction than what Rich is talking about here. But those are things that I see all too often in our implementations as common real world challenges to being successful in these relationships with suppliers.
Without a doubt. I think it's interesting as I think back to some of my own experiences, and I know we've really been focused on what I would call the deployment, the initial creation, structuring, and everything else. But I think one of the critical challenges is that after you're live, after you're 6 months, 2 years down the road, I think one of the critical challenges that I have seen develop so often is that there is no repeatable process or a built-in process for continuous improvement. And I jokingly call those programs a zombie program, right? Because they're kind of undead and moving forward, but there's no active growth in them. Would love to just kind of, what are your thoughts on that? Certainly there's a number of what I would call very qualitative ways that you can measure the success, number of suppliers or whatever else. But I think one of the pieces that quite often can get missed is feedback, both from the supplier pool as well as feedback from your internal customers. So just maybe a couple thoughts on continuous improvement. And I know, we're going to run a little bit over. We're probably 5 or 6 minutes starting late. So let's go ahead and just kind of go through this. But yeah, what are your thoughts on just kind of a continuous improvement program overall?
Excellent call out, Kevin. Thank you. Because again, this is one of those things that is so easily overlooked. It's like, what happens next? We have this initial success. How do we follow up on it? So I would say one of the performance metrics. Now, there are industries that are naturally, I think, disposed, I think, to having some of those built-in processes. Quality control, if you have a manufacturing, like, you have to know if the thing doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. We kind of know that, right? Because things aren't coming together. But to your point, it's some of these more qualitative or service-oriented industries or things like that kind of run into these processes more often than not. How do we follow up on this? Well, I would say one of the things that I'll point out here is an example of this would be certificate management, things that come over time that, hey, these need to be renewed, need to be tracked. They might be competencies, they might be diversity, veteran owned, they might be, something else. Luckily, SAP, the product that we use, has a tool for that where it's got a built-in process that's going to notify people, that's going to notify both the supplier base and the internal base. Hey, something new has to happen here, right? Something is expiring. We need to re-engage in this process. So I think this also speaks again to the long tail standardization process, right? You have to think further along in the supplier relationship. The nice thing is, again, if you choose the right tool, oftentimes they will have tools and features that allow that relationship to expand and mature inside of the four walls of this tool that you have stood up. And so I think having a plan for accessing additional features with the tool that you have purchased is also really important. You can't just, if you, needless to say, there's a phase one, you have to get something stood up, but you also need to be thinking early on. And again, this isn't just about SAP. There are other great tools out there, but if they oftentimes have these other sets of functionality that allow you to track, expand, improve the relationship, improve the management of that supplier relationship. And you have to have a plan to do that, so those just don't live there, quietly. So again, thinking about that strategic choice, that may be a year, that might be 3 years down the road before you're fully able to do that. But having a plan for those features, I think, is extremely important. I mean, that seems like low-hanging fruit. And again, it might seem like common sense, but I see so often that our customer base sometimes will come back and then not be aware or remember, these other really rich feature bases that they already have access to as part of this tool that they've purchased. That would just be one example there, Kevin. There certainly are others, but that's a very concrete example that I would say I've seen repeatedly. So yeah.
I think it's interesting because one of the mantras I always preach to customers back in the day when I was doing deployments, and it kind of drives me crazy that the 80-20 rule is consistent. Whether it is functionality of the platform or really the total continuity of the process.
Yeah.
Kind of to your point, right? I mean, inside of certainly the SLP platform, but the overall supplier management process, if you try to get to a 95, 98, 100% process right out of the gate, you can never go live. So I think it's really, I think it's really kind of defining, listen, these are the core practices that we want to deploy. This is the core process for how we're going to measure success, how we're going to continue to engage the supplier ongoing. And then once you've been live for whatever that time period is, I know 6 to 9 months tends to be enough time for the business to have used the tool, lived with it, understood it, and be ready to come back and make some tweaks to it. Just as a general thought throughout, I would say that if from any platform, but certainly inside the supplier management space as well, if you're not re-engaging the entire process for just an overview or how you're managing it every 6 to 12 months, you should probably look at that. Just in general. So I know we've gone a little bit long today. Really appreciate everyone staying on that you did. Just in general, a couple of quick closing remarks and thoughts on my side, and then Rich, I'll kick it off to you. But from our standpoint here at Premicati, number one, really appreciate the engagement and you joining us. It's actually been a fun journey over the course of the summer. It is crazy that we're coming into fall now. We certainly have a very busy fall coming up with SAP Ariba's Spend Connect out in Las Vegas this time. But once again, thank you very much for participating, coming over here. Rich, is there anything you'd like to add as a closeout?
Just again to say, toot the same or beat the same drum here. Take supplier enablement and engagement seriously. This is, on the one hand, it's common sense, but on the other hand, it so often ends up getting, I think, a little bit of second position to just standing up a big tool. You want to make sure that you take the supplier onboarding stuff seriously, communicate well, that'll lay the foundation for a great deployment and ongoing supplier relationship that's healthy and effective for your business, for sure. Yep.
Awesome. So with that, thank you once again, and I hope you all have a great day.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks all.